Now we're official. Thank you everybody for coming to the Common Concerns workshop on hosting a virtual internship. Who knew 2.5 years ago that this would be a thing, that we would have to learn how to adapt and change from traditional modes of internships and allowing students and graduate students to get experience to now hosting them remotely and virtually. So today we're going to learn some tips from someone who works with students every single day. We're going to hear from Dylan High, who is the graduate advisor for the University of Washington's museology program. Like I said, he's a graduate advisor up there. He holds a bachelor's in anthropology and music from Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And he's a graduate of the master's program in museology at the University of Washington. And prior to coming to the UW, he was involved in museum education, youth programming, and event planning, all skills that he uses in his role now. And he primarily works with students on advising them on internship opportunities, course guidance, and career preparedness. So I'm going to get out of the way and let Dylan take it away and kind of give us some tips, some do's and some don'ts, and then we will open up at the end for a Q&A with Dylan. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be collecting them through the presentation, and we're excited to hear from you, Dylan. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Andre. It's good to see all of you, some of you again that I've had a chance to talk with in my role, working particularly with internship sites. So it's good to see some familiar faces and names, and I'm excited to meet the rest of you as well. I will just kind of in the forefront, my informal conversation got a little bit more informal. I ran into a little bit of computer issues, so I had just a few slides. I'm not very big on PowerPoints anyway. I don't have some fun visuals to show off today. So, but I figured at least, really, I feel like most of this is best for an informal conversation anyway. And to start off, I would love to just get a sense from you all that are here today about if there are any particular, what are the biggest challenges or concerns that you have for hosting remote internships? I'd love to just get a sense of kind of collectively what what people are thinking about, what the concerns are. And hopefully, again, we kind of address some of them throughout, and then also like kind of get into some of them in the questions at the end. So if you wouldn't mind just like typing in the chat, just letting me know what your biggest concerns are about remote internships, that'd be great. While you're doing that, I just kind of want to do kind of a little bit of background and grounding. For me, I always like to start when we talk about like internships and what are the best practices for remote internships, to kind of start with the grounding of like what we're even doing the internships for. Not to get too in the weeds, but I do feel like having that grounding around like what is it that we're trying to accomplish can really shape a lot of the conversation and the decisions about like what are the approaches that you take when you're trying to put together a remote internship. So and I like to think about this kind of on both sides of the equation of the exchange, right? So for the student side, what is it that they're looking for in internships, and for them, this is, primarily a learning experience, right? And learning that can be, pretty broadly defined. And actually, when I talk with my students about putting together kind of learning outcomes and things like that, I have a pretty broad range of examples, and I'll talk about them in a little bit. But that can be things like skills and knowledge. It can be things kind of about like learning about your organization, about the field. And again, I work primarily with museum studies graduate students. So you might work with students that are undergraduate students, high school students. They might be coming from history or art history or, a different context. So what they want to learn about may be different, but really their main motivation for pursuing these internships is for that learning experience. So I always think about, the biggest first step in any of these things is really getting to know the interns that you're working with. Like, what is it that they're interested in learning about, and kind of getting that understanding, because again, I think that can be really the foundation of whatever format your internship takes. That's really the foundation of it. And then for organizations, and talking with organizations throughout the years, everyone has different, some different things that they want to get out of, bringing in an intern. But I think primarily some of the things that I hear is really about that benefit of having a fresh perspective, of having someone that's new and excited to get into the field, to have some ability to do a little bit of potentially mentorship, and helping to spark that interest for interns. So again, I start with all of this because one of the things I want to try and move the conversation along from a model of thinking of internships as primarily free labor from students, and again, I think oftentimes with the very best of intentions, we fall into models of what we have seen or experienced through internships in the past. So I don't see that as some kind of people doing that in some kind of malicious intent, but I think it's really easy. That's the model that we've seen and experienced through internships very often. And so I think you're really trying to consciously challenge a little bit of that notion to just fit this into, we have a project and this is someone that could do it, for free or for cheap, right? And the other reason I say that too is because I also do want to emphasize for these internship experiences, the other side of this that I sometimes see is organizations or people who really see, and again, I experience this a lot with my graduate students, organizations that see this as, well, they're the students that are doing this master's degree, they've got all the ideas, they're going to come in and I don't know that I have much to offer, right, in that supervision mentorship piece. And what I always like to challenge is you do have a lot to offer. You have the experience and the knowledge about your organization, and there's a lot that students really do want, that kind of, again, that learning experience to learn from you, and what your role within the organization, and being able to kind of help and model for them what working in a museum and a nonprofit is all about, what that kind of context looks like. Because oftentimes in classes, they get the opportunity to do things kind of within a very kind of set of confines, right? Working on an exhibit within an exhibits class, right? Or working on one of the grants class, but to be able to see that in context within what the organization is doing is super helpful. Okay, so again, that to me is the baseline of what we're doing internships for. So from there, I really think about it then as there are some kind of core practices or principles and the ways in which to approach, to me, it's good internships all around. I think the thing that is different between in-person internships and remote is the way that those practices get implemented, right? And the ways in which you think through them, instead of just taking like a project or something that would be an internship in person and just saying, well, now we're just going to do it virtually. You might be, approaching these practices in a little bit of a different light. So the first is really for any good internship should have defined outcomes, like learning outcomes. What is it that the student is going to get from the experience? So as I mentioned kind of generally before, I think that there's a really broad range that can fall under what kinds of outcomes a student could work on in an internship. So one, and probably the most common that I see, is kind of like specific skills. So, cataloging skills, developing curriculum, facilitating tours, donor engagement, whatever it may be, right? That's kind of one area. There is also something to be said about learning around kind of interpersonal skills, communication, things like, again, learning about the organization, learning about the board, learning about how to apply this the work that they're doing towards the mission of an organization, right? So those aren't, maybe not necessarily the outcomes that would come to mind at first, but I do think are really important. And there is actually a framework. I'll type it in the chat as well. I apologize, I don't have the link handy, but it's called the ISL framework, or the informal science learning competencies framework. One of our faculty who retired a few years ago was involved in the project, but really helpful in outlining some outcomes that can for professional development. So again, these are kind of more broadly defined. So they're things around, organizational understanding and operational competencies and things like that, right? So again, can help broaden the perspective of what kinds of outcomes an intern can get out of an internship experience. At the end of the day, to me, what's really important is that those outcomes are co-created between you and the student, or you and the intern. That ideally, the way that these internships come together and are formed are, a student might have some things that they are really interested in learning about, right? If they are interested in education and maybe they've had a chance to facilitate a lot of tours, but they haven't had an opportunity to develop curriculum, they might come in and say, like, this is something that I'm really interested in gaining some experience, learning more about. Again, getting back to that piece of what you have to offer, I think, you have a lot to offer to be able to give some insight into what are skills that you think are valuable for someone to know that wants to work in these organizations. What I always tell people is, like, think about, like, what would you look for if you were going to hire someone, and how can you maybe frame some of those potential outcomes to fit within what you would be looking for in someone that you would want to hire to work in your organization. And again, that can be super valuable because, especially, depending on the age or experience level of a potential student, they might not, be that far along in their professional experience to be able to really know that context of what are the skills that organizations are really looking for at this point. So to work on those together is ideal. And, again, thinking about what does this mean for if you're virtual, one of the other things to really think about is, like, what do you have the capacity to help a student learn virtually, right? So, again, thinking about if you have a student that's really interested in cataloging, and the resources that the projects that are available for them to work on remotely are going through, a spreadsheet of existing catalogs and kind of updating information, like, is that a reasonable experience that would contribute to what it is those students want to learn? So, the way that I always frame it to my students is, I want them to be transparent about what it is that they're hoping to learn from experience, because the organization can always then look at it and say, we just don't have the capacity to offer that kind of learning experience. And I think that's okay, right? At the end of the day, you want it to be mutually beneficial. And so, even if you're super excited with working with a student, if that experience just isn't there, right? It doesn't mean that there isn't another student that might be super excited about that project, but it just might not be a good fit for that one student, that one intern. Actually, before I go on, I just want to check in and see, does that feel familiar? I realize, and I jumped through this a lot, coming from a museum education background and then working in higher ed, learning outcomes feel comfortable to me, but for some people that is like new territory. Does that give some context about what types of learning outcomes might look like? Does anyone have questions or concerns about thinking about learning outcomes for interns? Okay. Perfect. Oh, go ahead, Sue. Sorry. Sue, was that you? Okay. Well, I'll keep going. If you have a question, feel free to jump back in and interrupt me, or you can type in the chat. Again, I'm super informal, so I do not mind at all if you want to jump in if you have questions. So um, the second thing that I would emphasize kind of core practice for really good internships is that, as I just said, this should really be meaningful to both you and the student, right? And I think it's really about striking that balance of, again, this should be, obviously this is a learning experience and students might have particular things that they're hoping to learn out of the experience. But also the way that they're going to learn best is if it's a meaningful project and experience that is meaningful to your organization, right? It gives them the most opportunities to actually apply what it is that they're doing in meaningful work. So one of the things that museology did early on in the pandemic that I think really helped to strike this balance was we toyed around with and have been implementing in kind of a newer format for internships. So we've been doing summer group internships, and instead of them being focused on a specific task, they're problem based. So for example, we had a group the first year who worked with an organization who was looking at creating a new, re-envisioning their membership model. We had students last year who looked at accessibility of the accessibility of virtual education programs for an organization. And the key difference, I think, is that the students were working in groups, and it's and their final product was kind of a set of deliverables that were usually something around like kind of recommendations or guidelines, and might include maybe like one or two examples of ways in which to do this. But so instead of it just being, we're going to create a new education program, it was more a way of kind of creating a set of guidelines and resources that the organization could continue to use and implement, which I think was valuable for the students because they got, it was, they got to do something where they were actually like problem solving an issue. They were able to create like a final deliverable of these kind of like set of recommendations that they could, again, kind of have as like something that they completed, something they could put on their resume or and showcase. And then valuable for the organization because it was something that kind of outlived the interns, right? That it was not just a one and done project, but it was something that the organization could continue to go back to as a resource. So again, I'm not advocating specifically that every organization go out and do this specific model, but I think, thinking creatively about ways that you can make this valuable for you and the student so that it doesn't have to just be, a one particular kind of project that that the internship is framed around. You can kind of get creative at thinking about what are the ways in which we can really engage students virtually in something that's really meaningful to us. Okay. The third thing I always try to emphasize is appropriate supervision. So again, going back to like, they have things to learn from you. And this can be one of the hardest things virtually, is being able to have someone that can work with that student and give them feedback. And so one of the things that I always recommend for organizations that are doing internships with our students is at least a weekly check-in. And for me, that means like a Zoom meeting or something, right? It's easy to kind of put it all towards email and just email me the questions as they come up. And sometimes that's effective and appropriate, but it doesn't really lead to like the relationship and the ability to actually like come to you with questions, or even just come with questions on the spot. And I've seen it kind of lead to frustration in the end, because it's easier through email for there to be kind of misunderstood expectations or communication. And so being able to have those like check-ins and dialogue is super is super valuable for the student, and also I think in the long run for the people that are working with them, so that you don't feel like you've put a project out towards the interns and feel like you have an idea of what it is that they're working on, and at the end of the internship it's something completely different, right? So being able to maintain that relationship, I have found to be incredibly useful. I don't see that as meaning like micromanaging, right? I'm not, I don't think that, and I don't think most people even want to do that necessarily, right? But to me, it's more about kind of being able to foster that relationship. And it's way easier if you just set it up at the beginning of the internship to have a recurring weekly meeting. If you get to the end of the week and you're like, we don't really need the meeting, it's easier to kind of have that found time than it is to try and make time to like schedule a new meeting. So, and then, the other piece of this isn't quite supervision, but I do think is again important, and one of the things that is something to think about with what I've seen happens with virtual internships is there's a lot of the just kind of clandestine opportunities to just bump into people when you're at the organization and meet other people and get to know kind of what else is going on in the organization that is really hard to replicate in a virtual internship. So I think it's okay to be upfront about that it's just kind of difficult to replicate that, but it's worth thinking about, are there ways in which you can kind of intentionally create opportunities for students to meet with other people in your organization, whether that's other volunteers, other board members, even if it's just like, I don't know, there's the possibility that they could utilize the oral histories and you want to connect them with your organization's, librarian or whoever's working on oral histories, even if that doesn't necessarily directly, lead to a huge part of their project. The fact that they have an opportunity to like connect one-on-one, learn a little bit more about what it is they're doing, those kinds of like little ways of connecting interns to other parts of your organization, I think are really helpful in kind of overcoming that isolation, because I think that the biggest barrier with virtual internships is that isolation factor. And I will say, for what it's worth, again, and this is something I think early on it felt like, just invite them to like staff meetings, things like that. I think one of the things that we're seeing throughout this is even that can be really difficult, because if you're in a group meeting, I mean, you can see it's going to be really hard for me to engage individually with each of you. Whereas if we were in person, like, people filtering in, people filtering out, it's easier to kind of have that one-on-one. So thinking about those opportunities for one-on-one connection is super helpful. The other thing I would say is be really clear at the beginning about expectations and about modes of communication and the ways in which you're communicating, right? For us, we do have this agreement form that we have students fill out at the beginning of the internship with their organization to outline those kinds of things. What are the expectations? What is, in terms of like working hours, when they're working, is it flexible? Do you want them working at particular times? What is your kind of communication timeline for getting back to people? Again, this is one of the things, personally, I know like it's going to be really hard for me to get right back to you with email questions, especially when I get an email with 5 questions in a row, right? So being able to set some of those things up front to say, like, we're going to have weekly meetings, you'll have an opportunity to ask them these questions, but if there's something immediate that comes up, email me and I will try and get back to you within 2 days, whatever, right? So just being very clear so that they know what the expectations are, and so that it doesn't, again, lead to frustration. And on the other end of things, right, to talk with them about like, what is your expectation, or even just asking, like, what is their timeline for responding to emails, things like that, right? So again, that there's clarity on both ends. And again, I think that's, being virtual, there are so many different communication tools. So I think if you can really think from the beginning about, what systems you already utilize, and kind of, again, being upfront with them about these are the communications channels that we use within our organization. It might be email for some questions, meetings for some questions, I don't know, collaborative Google Docs for other things, right? But if you can be really kind of clear about those, what channels are in place from the get-go, I think it will lead to less confusion later on. And then, so the last principle I would say is thinking about what resources you have at your disposal that would be available for virtual internships. Again, I think this is one where it can be really easy when you're used to being able to, you know, run into the museum if you need to and access that exhibit space or whatever, to kind of overlook that mentally, right? But you want to think through, like, what is the project that we're proposing and what are the resources that student might need? And would those be reasonably accessible to that student? I would include in resources like personnel, right? So if, you know, if there's a particular staff, volunteer, otherwise that they would be working directly with, you know, if they are, you know, not always available, or, you know, or the progress on the internship is really going to hinge on that resource, which may or may not be available at specific times, then really kind of think about like what that actually means for the framing and in how you're framing the internship. You know, so again, just to use like an example, like if you have, I'll just again pick on the collections projects for a second, but like if you have a collections project, but that intern wouldn't be able to access your collections database, and it would have to be you pulling information all the time, right? Like, do you have capacity to do that all the time and be responsive? And if yes, like great, but if not, then maybe that's, you know, not the best fit for a virtual internship. So just to really quick recap what those core principles were, I would say define learning outcomes that are co-created. The work is meaningful to the student and to you. That there's appropriate supervision and opportunities to connect. That there's clear expectations and channels for communication, and then that you've thought about the capacity and the resources that you have available for interns. Those to me are going to be, you know, 95% of thinking about like what is the thing that's going to make this a meaningful experience to students. And again, you know, I don't think that there's any one right answer for what is meaningful to the student, what is meaningful to you, what the student can learn, what, you know, that's going to really depend on what that student wants to get out of the experience and what it is that you're, you know, what kinds of opportunities that you have, and you want to have students involved in that process, right? So that's one of the other things when I'm talking with organizations that the question kind of comes up is, you know, do you think this makes for a good internship experience? And you know, I mean, it's always going to be kind of like yes and maybe no, right? Depending on who that student is. Some students are going to want a little bit more flexibility and chance to run with ideas and then come back and check in with you. Some people are going to want to check in with you more often. And I think that, so some of that is going to, you know, you're going to have some clarity about what your limits are, what you feel like you can provide a good experience around, and what might not be a good fit for you or your organization. Real quick, I just have a few tips, and then I would love to kind of get back into like questions about what I've seen kind of coming in through the chat. So again, and I think most of these we've kind of talked on, but like, you know, being really intentional about including interns at the organization. The other bonus that I will say too is, I'm sure that many of you have a pretty awesome network of other museum professionals. There are connections within the community, and even those kinds of connections can be really valuable and useful for students to feel like they are, again, part of the organization and part of something larger, right? So thinking about ways to intentionally include them in those things. Again, capacity and communication are huge, and thinking about what kinds of tools are out there. So I mentioned, again, email, Zoom. There are also and again, I don't think you need to go and create new systems for yourself, but if you are interested, there are also lots of other project management tools that are either, free or, some cheap versions, things like Asana or Trello. Again, Google Documents, I feel like students are super familiar with just using the Google suite of products. So are there other ways in which you can kind of get some of those communications and moving projects forward beyond just using email? And to me, the bulk of setting up a really good internship is in that kind of very first phase, planning out what the project's going to look like, being really clear in the communication early on with students about what to expect, and what the timeline, if there's a project timeline or schedule that you can create at the beginning, that's like a checklist or something that can help students kind of frame how far along should I be at certain points, what should I be aiming for. I mean, you can always internally adjust that as you go along, but for an intern that might be doing some of this work, again, in an organization for the first time, that timeline might feel a little bit unfamiliar. So having some of those things kind of that you can work on early on, I think the more that you can kind of get front load a lot of that work, it's going to make the rest of that virtual internship feel so much more productive and successful. That is what I had for my piece, but I would love to talk more with you and hear what your questions are. Again, I was very briefly scanning through some of the things that came up or at the beginning that you mentioned about accessibility with virtual internships, things about, kind of chasing people down for updates and projects. Again, I think hopefully we've touched a little bit on that, but I'd love to hear more. I know Sue had to jump off, but she did mention being concerned about these being time consuming and legal requirements. One thing I will say is, the time consuming pieces gets into the capacity. I think that is one thing that I always advocate for, is that I have worked around museum people long enough to know everyone has the best of intentions and really is excited about working with interns. But I think that is one thing to be really honest about, is, do I have the capacity to make this a meaningful learning experience? And I think at the end, if the answer is no, it's probably best to say this isn't the best time for an intern, for you and the intern, because then it can just end up being harder to make that happen. And there's always another, it doesn't mean that there's no interns forever, but maybe just this isn't the right time. But yeah, anyway, I'll stop there. But I would love to hear a little bit more about any particular questions that you had that you want to talk about. Oh, Allison said, yeah, to talk a little bit more about the learning outcomes. So, well, again, the easiest ones for me to think of on the spot are education-based ones, because those are what I have a background in. But, one type of learning outcome might be something around a student that would say, I would like to learn how to incorporate Common Core standards into curriculum development for an informal learning program, right? That to me would seem like a reasonable learning objective. And it's something that you can then utilize in looking at, if this is what you're saying that students learning about in the internship, that's a tool to be able to go back and say, how is this project helping that student get this experience in some ways, right? Because it can be easy to kind of jump into a project and just end up the project becoming primary. And it doesn't mean that you totally ignore the project, but I think the more that you can, that the student and you can be explicit about what are the particular things that they're learning about through the experience. Another one, again, if I'm thinking like a maybe more generalizable one, would be I don't know, like learning about how to work with a board in a volunteer-run organization, right? That might not be a specific a specific skill set, but it's more about general like context and understanding of the work of an organization. So, but yeah, generally the outcome is something that's like can be tangibly achieved, right? So not just like, I want to be the best, I want to be a better educator. I mean, that's great, but like, what does that actually mean, right? So it's something that's kind of can be as tangible and specific as you can make it.
Awesome. And we've got a couple of questions in the chat, but I just saw Jim raise his hand. Yeah, feel free. You guys can ask questions out loud of Dylan. So Jim, you had your hand up?
Just would like to hear some specific examples of intern projects specifically focused on small museums.
Yeah, we've had quite a range. So for example, like we've had a number of students that have developed like exhibit plans all the way up through actually like developing and installing the exhibit. But the exhibit plan could be really, basically, putting together the exhibit brief, right? The what is the theme, the concept, the themes, the objects that are going to be used, the labels, could even get into the full actual like design mock-up of that, again, depending on what the student might be interested in. We've had students that have worked on I should say like virtually too. So we've had students do actually those plans for like physical exhibits, but also for like virtual exhibits or experiences. We've had a number of students that did, let me think, like a lot of the collections-based ones were about making the collections more accessible to the public. So that might be like highlights or things that might go on to like a museum blog, or potentially even going through like a catalog and with museums that have plans for like making their collections available online, maybe actually like going back through and making sure that the lexicon matches and makes sense for someone that might access those collections online. What else? Particular to small organizations.
So
trying to think of different domains, like, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just it seems like there's the dramatic difference between an online experience relationship versus the physical connection. And so like, for instance, working on exhibits, for instance, or designing a specific space or something like that. It seems like that would not fit with the online aspect of it, the virtual aspect of this program.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the way how much of that project they're working on. So like, if they have, and again, it will really depend on the museum conduct. But again, if the museum has their collection available online so they can get access to looking at what collections are available, they could put together, maybe not specifically they might not actually be installing the exhibit, right? But they could put together the idea for what the exhibit would be that would get installed into a physical space, or likewise again for a virtual internship or a virtual exhibit. So yeah, I mean, a lot of that will really kind of depend on, again, what are the resources available that you have for that kind of project, whether or not that would make sense for your organization. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
So, Dylan, one of the things I'm running into, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay. One of the issues that we run into, so we have a variety of options for our interns. There's fully in person, which we have limited, we're still kind of limiting how many people we can have. We have hybrid options, and then we have remote options. And the struggle I'm having is when I have someone that's in-house, I can kind of, check in regularly with them when they're here. And even the hybrid ones, sometimes those get a little funky, but for the most part, we can do that. When they're completely virtual though, what you end up having is you set up the Google Meet and say, okay, we're meeting on this day, like every other week on this day, and they don't show up, or they'll email and go, I can't make it that time. Can we reschedule? And then this happens repeatedly. Or when they do come to a meeting, they don't have questions, they don't have information. And you're like, okay, then where are you in your project? He's like, well, I'm working on it. And so it's much more difficult to get kind of concrete. What are you working on? What's going on? Where are you in the project? So that's kind of one issue that I'm having. The other issue I'm having, so I'm at Clark County Historical Museum, we're really just formalizing our internship program over the last year and a half. But I've run internship programs elsewhere where the schools were more concrete on their expectations and who the line of communication was. And
Okay.
I'm not getting that from the schools here. Like, I don't have a clear contact so that if I'm having issues with the student, I can go, hey, this is what's going on. I need you to follow up.
Okay.
So it's like
Really?
two different issues, but they
Yeah,
kind of combine to cause one major issue. Because then at the end of the internship, I have no project finished.
Right.
I haven't had clear conversations,
Right.
and they're still getting their credit.
Right. So, well, the one thing, I mean, I don't know if this is a great answer for your second one, but the second one is there should be someone. I mean, for our program, that's me, right? And that's when I send out the internship agreement, that's, I say, like, if there are questions, email me, right? Because again, I am the point of contact for students, and that's part of the things that I want to know about and be able to figure out, like, and we have as part of our agreement form, these are the expectations for students, for organizations, right? And also that's why I put in our agreement form, these are the expectations, right? Because to me, again, and this is where I see, like, when I talk with students and organizations, it's like 98% of the internships that we have no problems. When there are problems, it's usually because the expectations aren't maybe clear or explicit, or especially with virtual internships, is probably just a harder read, right? Because they're virtual, they're not necessarily seeing you all the time and thinking about, like, they might not even be, depending again on what their schedule is and their flexibility. Like, if they're just kind of working on it on a flexible schedule, maybe it's like, oh crap, I haven't done anything, I'm going to reschedule that. You know what I mean? Like, they haven't had the opportunity to really kind of have set time. So for me, the first part is the best line of defense that I have for that is really about just like super clear expectations at the beginning. And maybe it's even, again, not that I'm trying to advocate for, like, being a total hard ass about a lot of things, but, like, to say, like, for you to get credit, I need you to be in communication, and we need to, have these regular check-ins, something like that, right? So that there is pretty clear that it's like, you're serious about having these check-ins, that the point of them is to be able to check in and have progress on those things. Because once it gets into that habit of, like, I can't really reschedule, and then it's like, well, there's not really a consequence if I have to reschedule, right? Then it just gets really hard to manage that aspect of it. So Um, and again, to me, and I'm saying this too, because I've worked with like high school interns when I was working with museums, and that was one of the mistakes I made with them early on, is I felt like I didn't want to give them too much responsibility, but then it was just super easy for them to kind of like blow it off as like, this isn't super important to them, so then I can, you know what I mean? So if it's like, we have these expectations because this project is important to us, it's meaningful to us, the work that you're doing is meaningful to us, might help kind of encourage a little bit more of that better behavior of like showing up to the meetings and kind of being prepared for those meetings. And to be honest, for what it's worth for me, like that's also a good learning outcome, is like learning that professional communication, those professional standards of like meeting up and showing up prepared for a meeting. I don't know how helpful that is. I'm sorry that you're running into the issue of not finding contacts within the organization.
Well, and that seems to be the biggest problem. If you really have no, it's almost as if there's really no power at that point, because if you don't have a contact, if they know they're going to get their credits without you even being able to sign off, then it's like, okay, I can say it all I want, it means nothing. And so that's really the frustration, to the point where I'm not taking remote interns anymore, because I can't take remote interns and then spend all my time trying to set up a project and then have a project not done and have them not show up and stuff. And so, which is frustrating for me, because we have a limited, I mean, Southwest Washington, we don't have a whole lot of options.
Yeah. What might be helpful, so again, I don't know particularly like which schools you're working with and what, but what might be helpful, so for example, for UW, for you know, if they're museology students, obviously I'm the point of contact. There are, you know, students can work with interns, there's other graduate programs, there's the Masters in Library and Information Science, sometimes their students are involved in like archiving projects, they usually have a point of contact for their directed field works, but again, a graduate advisor is a good point of contact for that. If it is like a particular department that students are getting their internship credits through, like, you know, I don't know, anthropology, archaeology, you might want to again look for either an advisor, if you can find like a staff contact there. UW also has a like career and internship center, and there's I don't know if it's a part of that or if it's a separate one. We have it's called the Carlson Center, but they also have basically like a general ed internships course that students can sign up for if their major doesn't have an internships requirement. So there should be a contact on that end. That would be, again, assigning the grade. And I feel like if you can get in touch with that person to figure out, because if they don't know that that's an issue, right, like they probably would, right? They would probably want to know that. And so it might be just helpful to see if you can find that point of contact. So, sorry, maybe, yeah. Real quick, I think hopefully I can do this quickly. James asked about if interns are supervised by staff, or can they be board members? For our program, it can be staff, or it can be board members, particularly for volunteer run organizations. Oftentimes that is the case. Our only rule is that we can't have a student supervise another student. Sometimes we have students that work in these museums, and so I wouldn't let one of their peers supervise another student. It just feels like it creates a weird conflict of interest. But yeah, for us, I don't have a preference. And I don't know if this gets into too, like the questions about legal requirements. I need to do a big preface on this. Like, I am not a legal advisor. And so I would always say, you know, what you should say is check with a lawyer. But what I can say is, I know from looking through and having to work through like our paid internship program, one of the nonprofits are given a lot of flexibility in general around this, but regardless of that, I would say the most important thing is that these are looked at as primarily learning experiences, and they shouldn't be there to or they can't be there to replace paid labor, right? So or a paid position, right? So that would be one of the things, particularly for unpaid internships, I should clarify. So that would be one of the big things that I would be concerned about. And again, I think most lawyers are going to look at it through like these multiple lens of like, what are the things that you have in place that are indicating that it is such, right? So things like having supervision, defined learning outcomes. One of the things that actually kind of does bug me, I think it's stemming out of some of these legal concerns, is the listing, and again, I'm not trying to pick on anyone because I think this is just a common practice, but listing getting academic credit as compensation, where in some ways it's actually kind of the opposite, because sometimes our program is a flat rate tuition, but some you pay per credit, and so actually that's almost like the opposite of compensation, that they have to that they have to pay to get the credit. But part of that is looking at it as, because if they're getting academic credit, then someone's going to look at that as like, oh, this is a learning experience because they're getting academic credit for it, right? So again, I'm not saying that there's any issues, and of course we want students to be able to get academic credit for it, but I would say that that's not, and I understand the reasons why that might be listed, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's compensation, but it may help with, in terms of like framing this as a learning experience. So anyway, I digress.
Well, thank you so much, Dylan. I was kind of going through the chat, and I think that we got through most of the questions that we had, but of course, none of us are going away. All of you guys have our email addresses here, and we'll share Dylan's contact info if he's comfortable with that, as well as the recording of this. Yeah, we'll send the recording of this. So if you missed something, you can go back and listen, or send it out to someone in your organization that wasn't able to attend, so that you can make hopefully your internship program effective and a great learning experience for the interns, but also, like Dylan said, making sure that your outcomes and your project goals are being met as well. So I just wanted to thank you again, Dylan, and to everyone who came and took time out of your day to learn more about making our internships experiences better for our students and interns that we serve. So thank you, everyone. And if you have any additional questions, Dylan just put his email in the chat here, and I'll leave mine in there. If you have any additional questions, you can ask one of us. So awesome, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.